get started. Raina, want to kick us off?
Sure. First of all, welcome everyone. If you haven't heard, there are snacks and drinks in the kitchen. You're welcome at any point to go grab those, and you can bring them in here. We have kind of a large group, so we're going to skip going around and doing introductions today, but I will just introduce myself. I'm Raina. I'm on the branch committee for Socialist Alternative Grand Rapids, and
Charlie, also on the branch committee.
And Phil, also branch committee.
so we're just going to start kicking this off with a little bit about what is Socialist Alternative. So Socialist Alternative is an independent socialist party that aims to build a mass workers' party, an American labor party of sorts, to unite the working class and struggle against the billionaire class. We believe the Democrats and Republicans are both parties of big business and so are incapable of taking up this fight, which at its center must be anti-capitalist if we're to have any chance of winning lasting change. We've got active branches in many different cities around the country, so we're not just in Grand Rapids, and we're also in political solidarity with the Committee for a Workers International, a socialist organization active in over 40 countries, which is actually the largest of its kind. Unlike most parties, though, we're not really focused on electoral politics. We've run candidates in different cities and won in the case of Shama Swant in Seattle, but we don't do this to play politics. It's more about using the platform to advance social movements than simply winning elections for the sake of political power in and of itself. Both in Seattle, where we won our election, and in Minneapolis, where we lost, our organization was central to winning a $15 minimum wage, among other things. In our sister section in Ireland, where we have 3 members elected to their parliament, we were central in the recent legalization of abortion rights. In England, where we controlled the Liverpool City Council, we were central to defeating a nationwide poll tax and ultimately bringing down the Thatcher government. So how did a relatively small organization like ours, with or without an elected official, beat out such tremendous opposition and win gains for working people? That's more or less what tonight's about. And just a little bit about what the meeting format is going to be. We like to do for our discussions, we are going to have a lead off where Charlie is going to be talking about the central topic for the evening. And then what we'll do is take people in order. So you need to get my attention if you want to speak. Just raise your hand and I'll make a note and we'll kind of go in order. If you have any questions, the facilitators, which would be the 3 of us, can directly respond to that. But we would like to keep conversation out of this part of the discussion. We'll open it up at the end for people to be able to talk and discuss amongst one another. But what we're really going to be doing is just, if you have a comment or a question, wait till you're on stack. If you have a response to that, also raise your hand and go into stack. And that way we can make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Yeah. So Bernie fucking Sanders, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're excited. A little bit about me. I first started describing as a socialist probably around 2014, 2015. It was Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign that really started to get me into the concept of socialism. You could say Bernie Sanders was the reason I picked up the Communist Manifesto for the first time, wondering what this whole socialism thing was about. So Bernie Sanders is a very, very important figure. His campaign is extremely important, and that's why we think it's extremely important to talk about Bernie Sanders and the campaign that he's running. Socialism as a fighting movement has had its ups and downs in American history. Prior to the Occupy movement, socialism was a dirty word due to various things: state repression, the repression of unions, the repression of organized labor in general, whether that was McCarthyism and COINTELPRO in the 50s and 60s, or even just neoliberal politics, Reaganism in general. Has caused a demoralization of groups that would otherwise describe themselves as socialists. The Great Recession of 2008 was a huge turning point in this. It was the worst economic crisis in 80 years, many people of which still have not fully recovered from that, and many of which won't. It was brought on 100% by the pure reckless speculation of Wall Street, and they were rewarded with a massive bailout. There was no justice, just simply money from the American people going back to the people that caused the recession in the first place. Suddenly, however, we saw a huge resurgence in struggle. We saw the occupation of the Wisconsin state capitol in 2011. If you weren't following politics then, this was huge. Wisconsin has actually been a hotbed of socialist politics for a long time. Fun fact about our neighbors across the lake. But our party has some interesting material about that occupation, our participation in it, and our analysis of it. Very worth reading and checking out. But coming out of that was then came the Occupy Wall Street movement. This shifted the entire national conversation to the left. It brought into the common lexicon the idea of the 99% versus the 1%. We saw the rise of other organizations militantly taking to the street, like the Black Lives Matter movement that arose in 2013 in the St. Louis area. And we see Bernie Sanders and his electoral campaign that started in 2015 as sort of a delayed electoral response to this rising movement, or this rising series of movements and this rising shift of the American consciousness into more of a class-oriented struggle. And largely this comes out of things like the 2008 recession. You hear Bernie talk about the 2008 recession every single time he's on the pulpit, every single time he's giving a speech. In 2012, our party ran Shama Sawant. At that time, when we first ran Shama Sawant, our city councilor in Seattle, we called on the Occupy movement to run independent candidates to seize that momentum, that energy that was building at the time. Unfortunately, very few activists took up the call. This largely has to do with the fact that Occupy was a very it was a group of inexperienced activists that had no structure to them. They had no way to take what one of my favorite people in history, Lenin, called the steam and put it into the piston. They had no way of directing that energy. Bernie came out though, and suddenly he was using the term socialism. He was using the term, and he was using it broadly and proudly, and it caused a huge reaction as we saw throughout his 2016 campaign. But what's something that we really appreciate about Bernie, and something that is unique to Bernie, is one of the slogans that he uses, not me, us. He has called for over 1 million volunteers in this campaign, and he's already gotten it. And contrary to, obviously, Trump, but most of the other candidates there, the campaign has never been about him. It has always been about creating a movement around his campaign rather than a cult of personality. And even if he does win the general, fingers crossed, he's going to face enormous pressure to compromise his positions from not only the Republicans, but also the Democratic Party leadership, who is not in his favor. And that is why the not me, us is so important. When we talk about mass movements, we have to talk about class struggle. Every single major victory that the American people have ever seen has not come from a single politician. It has always come from working class people taking to the streets and demanding change. You can go as far back as the early labor movements demanding the 8-hour work week and demanding a minimum wage as a concept, child labor laws. All these things were only brought out after people were willing to put their lives on the line at times, referencing the Haymarket hangings. Look that up if you're not familiar with the Haymarket activists. But millions of people getting into the streets, demanding change, and then the powers that be eventually giving the people, if not everything they asked for, at least enough to appease them. And that's how the capitalist class functions. They'll give you just enough to get you back out of the streets so that you're quiet for a little while, and then they slowly peel back those reforms over years and years and years. Take the New Deal, for example. FDR gets put up on this pedestal as being this lion of progressive politics, but his original campaign was actually a platform of fiscal austerity. It wasn't until the growing economic crisis and then the movements of militant labor activists, militant trade unionists, socialists going to the streets and demanding that New Deal, that it finally got put on the table. FDR is quoted as saying, "I am the best friend that American capitalism has ever had," and that's correct, because after he put out that New Deal, all those movements just went to bed, because they thought that they got what they asked for, they had won what they had set out to get, and that's all they needed to do. So at the end of the day, we have to take these demands, these things that Bernie is asking for, and build a movement around those demands. And it can't be just centered around the demands themselves. It has to be an active, organized struggle against the capitalist class, against the people who may acquiesce to certain things, who may give us Medicare for all. But as we're seeing in England with the NHS, that was established in World War II. Best thing that ever happened to the country, and slowly but surely NHS has been clawed away, funding has been taken out. Now there's talks of privatization of different sections of their national healthcare system, and that's exactly how the capitalist class does its plays. It will give you what you want to shut you up, and if you don't constantly demand more, they'll slowly peel it away, and then eventually blame the thing that you asked for why the country is going wrong in the first place. Look at Social Security, look at Medicare, look at the Republicans saying, the Republicans, whose party initially gave us some of those things, going, yeah, this is the reason our budget's wrong, because of all these demands, all these entitlements, they call them. One thing is also for certain, the Democratic Party and the corporate media are not going to give Bernie an inch. We all learned that lesson in the 2016 campaign. The corporate media and their corporate sponsors don't want the things that Bernie Sanders is advocating for. The Democratic Party and its corporate sponsors do not want the things that Bernie Sanders is asking for. We as activists see this, and we know that the DNC is going to organize against him. We know that the corporate media is going to organize against him. We're seeing it now in the weaponization of the sexual harassment case brought up by one of his staffers, which she did later announce the way the media is portraying that as a bad take. She wanted to prove that that sort of thing can happen in any campaign, not that Bernie Sanders himself or his platform is somehow responsible for what happened there. The double standard regarding the question of reparations, where Bernie Sanders is being pushed on that far more than any other candidate. The planting of Washington insiders within that first town hall, we all saw that happen immediately. Those policy analysts that got asked, those plants of the DNC that were asking those loaded questions. The underreporting of his massive lead in terms of donations, in terms of volunteers. The weaponization of identity politics against him, spreading the idea that somehow he is responsible for Trump. And as was pointed out earlier, we are still a year from the primary. It is still 2019, and this is already what we're facing. If the Democratic leadership succeeds yet again in ramming through another status quo candidate, there is a risk that Trump could win this re-election. That is a very real risk that we all have to come to terms with, in spite of his unpopularity and poor standings in the polls. Certainly, an establishment candidate may be capable of defeating Trump, as the midterm suggests, but we do not accept in any way that a bankrupt corporate politician like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris are going to be an asset in defeating the right or in getting any of the things that Bernie Sanders and his campaign are demanding for working people. Bernie Sanders' platform may have found an echo among the deluge of 2020 candidates, but only he is pointing to building movements of the working class as a means to victory. And without that, even more consistently progressive candidates like Elizabeth Warren are unlikely to win key progressive demands. So the big question we as socialists have to ask and get asked a lot: should Bernie run as a Democrat? We think, and we demanded and petitioned and asked in his 2016 campaign, especially after he lost the primary, that he run as an independent. We understand the power of independent socialist candidates to galvanize the working class around their platforms. We think it would have been better if Bernie would have launched his 2020 campaign as an independent socialist and used his platform to build that new mass working party for the working class people, a new U.S. Labor Party running outside of the corporate politics of the Democratic Party and outside of corporate influence. Of course, we also recognize many people will agree with his decision to run as a Democrat on a purely pragmatic basis, and or out of some hope that the Democratic Party can somehow be remade into a people's party. And it's understandable that many are looking to reform the Democratic Party, but turning the Democrats into a party of working people would require far more than electing a few left Democrats. The party as a whole would need to reject corporate campaign contributions. It would need a binding platform and genuine democratic structures capable of holding its elected officials accountable. But the Democratic Party leaders would sooner leave their party than accept these sort of conditions. And it's true that Bernie will gain an enormous platform in the Democratic Party, but history doesn't offer an unlimited number of opportunities to build a movement of this kind, a political force that the working class people need in this country, and we have to learn from the past. That's why, accepting that he's going to compete in the Democratic Party, we think he should continue to run as an independent all the way to November of 2020, if the Democratic establishment succeeds in blocking him. He's already the most popular politician in the country, bar none. So such a break with the Democrats could lead to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of the best activists, progressives, and otherwise disaffected voters to join him in building a real political alternative against the billionaire class. Bernie Sanders has popularized the idea that the U.S. should be more like European countries and should provide everyone with free higher education, childcare, paid family leave, healthcare, all these things that we've heard him talk about since the 80s. He's repeatedly pointed out how the U.S. is the only major country in the planet without a universal public health care system. Bernie left out that we are also the only major country that has never established a viable mass workers' party. All the gains won in Europe in the mid-20th century are the result of working people building their own mass socialist parties. The ruling class feared the potential of the mobilized independent power of the working class to challenge the capitalist parties for control of society and to demand fundamental change. Yet in the United States, the unions and progressive organizations never succeeded in creating a mass independent party of our own, and instead supported the Democrats, a big business party. This is not primarily because of some superior design of the US political system. Historically, the stability of the two-party system was fundamentally rooted in the enormous expanding economic strength of US capitalism. Up through the 80s, every American generation lived better than their parents, cutting across support for socialist ideals and providing a material basis for the, quote, American dream for large sections of the working class. However, the last two generations are factually living worse than their parents, only staying above water on the basis of an expanding debt burden. Since the 1980s, neoliberal policies have hollowed out the American economy, producing unprecedented inequality, eroding the social safety net, and ushering in a new era of political upheaval. Especially since the 2008 economic crisis, the American dream has unraveled and opened up unprecedented space for a building socialist movement and the launching of a new mass party of the left. Capitalism is mired in an ongoing global crisis, and there's no prospect for a return to the previous era of generous social welfare states without mass struggle and a socialist transformation of society. A new party is necessary if we have any hope of winning. And it's important to recognize that no matter what shape this movement takes, it cannot stop in November. And by November, I do actually mean next November, because we got a long way to go. It might not be a pleasant question to ponder, but what if Bernie loses? What if Trump wins? What happens then? The only answer is to continue mobilizing our forces, just as we would have done in victory. As we mentioned earlier, victory is not out of reach just because the administration is against you. Look at the teachers' revolts. They're winning raises and better conditions for their students, even in the most reactionary anti-union states, as well as Democratic Party-held California. How? They're united in solidarity. They are shutting down business as usual through a massive strike action. They're not backing down just because the government said no. They're not twiddling their thumbs and waiting to vote them out years down the road. They're fighting. No matter what happens in this election, we must take the movement that Bernie is helping to build and turn it into a weapon against the billionaire class. Socialist Alternative views elections as one of many tools of the working class that we can use to fight for our interests. But we see social movements and the collective power of working people as the key vehicles for change. We use election campaigns to build the strongest possible grassroots struggles to force concessions from the establishment, whether or not the individual campaign wins or loses. The Ginger Jensen campaign in Minneapolis fought unapologetically for rent control and taxing the rich to fund affordable housing, because that's what working people need. And because we correctly anticipated that we could mobilize powerfully around these bold demands. We knew that the Democratic establishment was fiercely opposed to rent control, but our goal was to advance these struggles and not curry favor or win a Democratic endorsement. And we succeeded. We forced rent control to the front and center of the Minneapolis elections. We built strong momentum on the issue, which has continued to this day. And we did the same thing in 2019 with Ty Moore's candidacy for a similar city council seat on the $15 minimum wage issue. We used it to launch a springboard in the fight for 15, which ultimately won out despite years of Democratic oppression. We base our campaigns on the logic of class struggle. We don't moderate our demands to make them more reasonable or acceptable to the corporate elite or to the upper middle class professionals. Rather, we fight for far-reaching reforms that speak to the day-to-day needs of the working class people, even though it would put us in conflict with the corporate political establishment. Workers who are busy working and commuting will not make time to volunteer for a campaign that is not going to make real difference in their lives. They want someone who is going to go out boldly and fight for their interests. Imagine if Bernie won, and in his inauguration speech, he made an appeal to the American working class to join him in a mass protest on Capitol Hill to demand single-payer health care, tuition-free college, and a national $15 minimum wage. Imagine the President of the United States using their platform to call on workers to take sustained political action in demanding change. Almost every politician, Democrat and Republican, in the country would be sent into a panic, but the pressure to act would be insurmountable. We don't think this is something he is likely to do, but this is exactly the kind of politics that we need.
Or executive orders.
So-
we need the movement.
So that wraps up kind of my lead off there. We're gonna move into the discussion period. Just to kind of reiterate what Raina said, if you want to speak or have something to contribute, whether it's a question or a comment, just raise your hands. If you want to put Pete down.